This week, in our main segment here on Mastering Dungeons, we are going to do another bit of a dive into Greyhawk. Last week, we gave the basics of the Greyhawk setting and why we were talking about it. We're talking about it because Greyhawk will be the, quote, default setting that is shown as an example of a world in the 2024 Dungeon Master's Guide. Since they're doing that, we wanted to take a little look at Greyhawk, its history, its place in the game, how it works as a world, etc. So last week we talked its history and evolution. In 2000, they launched the third edition of D&D, and in doing so, they set the default world as Greyhawk. It did not get a full support, though. It got a Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, as Teos just held up and I'm holding up now. And that book went to support the first whole world living campaign, organized play campaign called Living Greyhawk. So what we're going to do this week is give a little bit of background and some detail on what Living Greyhawk was, how Teos and I participated in it, what it meant for games and gaming as a whole. And then we will dive into the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer to do a bit more of a examination of the world of Greyhawk, as well as what it means to create a world for a role-playing game. I'm going to take a breath and a drink now, Teos.
Yeah.
So feel free to dive in.
It's hard to properly explain how important Living Greyhawk was for Dungeons and Dragons, for Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition, for us, for people of this kind of era who are playing, and how new the concept was. Even though Living City really started it beforehand, how new this concept was for so many people and how shattering it was. Like it broke the gaming boundaries that we had in place, right? The RPG had been something where the point of it was sort of like, if you want to have a fan club in your area, we'll tell people about it and we will send you some games you can run there. And that's kind of it. And Living City said, well, what if we're all playing in the same location and we try to sometimes learn about what you did and we pull these things together, especially at conventions, but we start adding a sort of shared fiction based on what everybody has done, right? And maybe everybody at the premier convention plays this adventure, and the result that is most common, well, that becomes the history of what happened here, right? That became really, really cool. And Living Greyhawk did that, but it just turned all the dials to 11, right? And then it stared back and looked at you and asked you whether you understood how important this was. And it really was, because they did something that it was so amazing that it essentially can't be replicated anymore, because it broke everything, including everybody's brains who was trying to run this. But they set up a system of regions. And in fact, the last page in this Living Greyhawk Gazetteer has this. The table 7 Living Greyhawk regions, and it takes the areas on the map and it shares them out to different areas of the world. And really like the Bone March is Greece, Alyssa is Sweden, and then there's part of Alyssa that is Austria and Germany. Australia and New Zealand have Perrinland, Italy has the Sea Barons, and then it took all these other regions and it split them into areas of the US as well. So, you were in the Bandit Kingdoms if you were in Oklahoma and Texas. And what it did is, for each of these regions, it gave 3 people, a triad, control of designing the core and special adventures, or the regional adventures in that area, while a circle of administrators that oversaw the whole thing wrote core and special adventures. And this was really profoundly impactful for Greyhawk as a world, as a setting, as an experience, and the hobby as a whole, because it meant that there were these teams of people who were so focused on how to create an awesome story for my region. And if you remember last episode, we talked about the original box set, it has these tiny paragraphs for each region. So now you have these sets of 3 people who are looking at the content, and the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer has a little more setting info, as we'll talk about. But they're now looking at that and breathing life into all of that to create years of play in it, years of lore. Every little word gets expanded 100-fold, if not more, as all of the players interact with it, and dynamically so, right? The things that they do become part of the canon for that region, and it was just fascinating. So I've gone all over the place, Shawn.
No, I mean, you summed it up very nicely. A couple of points I'm going to add.
Yeah.
If you're a game master and you've ever wished that your players would take more of an interest in the story of the world that you created, imagine hundreds, if not thousands of people taking an interest in the region, in the world, and the stories that you're creating. That's what this was. So you would go and you would play an adventure. You play 3 or 4 adventures in your region. Then you would go, and this was the earlier days of the internet. So you would go to a Yahoo forum, a Yahoo group, and you would be chatting with either people who played the same adventure you did and just talking about it, and not even in a negative way. There was obviously some negativity, because there always is, but it was more excitement than negativity. It was more anticipation. You would have people not only talking about their characters and the adventure and the region itself that you're in, but in character stories would pop up everywhere, where people would write fiction about their characters. Not only there would be like no spoilers of the adventure you played, but fiction that wrapped around it. And it was just a completely synchronous event for hundreds and thousands and tens and thousands of people across the globe, because you could not play a adventure from a region that you were not in. So physically, if you lived physically,
the body, the Shawn body must be, your meat must occupy the space that was part of this. So to play an Alyssa adventure, I had to go to, Germany, and I could then play an Inspa Adri adventure. I had to go to Italy to play the first adventure, which I think was called In the Covi delle Pirati. In the Cove delle Pirati, in the Pirates Cove. I had to go to Italy to play that, right? Because that was the only way to do it. So that was a fantastic restriction that created mystique for the game, right? It had a draw. And in the US, it's a little easier. You didn't have to go to Italy to play that game. You could drive across the border of your state to another state where that might be a whole different region. And because of the triad system, what was achieved that has never done really before or since is culture. So, and again, take the Greyhawk starting with this tiny little box, and LGG, Living Greyhawk Gazetteer adds a little more to it. But the combination of the triads, the way that things would get play tested within the region itself, the region being closed off and inward focused like that, meant that you actually had culture. So for example, when I traveled to Texas for work and I played a Bandit Kingdoms adventure, there was a priest of Nerol who wanted an evil book that we had recovered. And the Bandit Kingdoms is a place where you're supposed to be kind of not very good. you're bandits kind of attitude. And your rulers are actually evil. And so all of the players go, oh yeah, we're just going to hand it over to the priest of Nerol. And my character, being from Jeff, a very good, very heroic type place, I pull back my arrow and I fire my arrow at the Nerolian priest. And everybody goes, what? I'm like, yeah, we don't do that where I come from. And combat ensued. And they were mad at me, right? In real life as well as in character, because that is not what one does in the Bandit Kingdoms, but I was not from the Bandit Kingdoms. And there are many examples of play like that. The Grand March versus Jeff versus Keeland, there were both actual political history things and real current events going on that force these regions into conflict so that the players at the table would wear t-shirts insulting each other even, right? I mean, there was so much culture to it. And I mean, it's really hard to explain how that all came to be, but it does trace directly back to how Greyhawk was written as a setting, right? It's like, and we'll get into the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer itself later, but I'd like to say, like, imagine if you're familiar with the Forgotten Realms, imagine the way that we think of Thayans, right, who are out to get you, but every region is kind of like that. Mm-hmm. There's some danger of all of them wanting to Thayan wizard you, even when it's Waterdeep or Baldur's Gate or any of these things that seem nice, right? Forgotten Realms, it's just the assumption that you can go from Watergate to Baldur's Gate and there's no problem. But what if you couldn't, right? What if there was danger in it and your sword might be held up to your throat to ask you, wait, you're from Baldur's Gate? What's your agenda?
What happens when your character worships a deity that is illegal in this other region?
Yeah.
Do you hide it? Do you not go? Do you create a new character and we'll play that character there because this character may get captured in this region?
Yeah.
And there were limits on how long you could play the character, which is another part of this game, right? You had a number of time units that you could spend each calendar year. And once you hit that limit, an adventure may cost 3 time units to play. So you could only play a certain number of adventures before that character could not play until the next calendar year began. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of that, both in-game and out-of-game figuring. How many do I want to play with this character? And something could happen where I could lose half my time units for the year because I was imprisoned. And that throws all my plans out the window. And so it was fun and engaging and interesting, not without its problems.
No,
we will be the first to tell you. But just the concepts of it had not been done to the extent that they were done in this sort of living setup.
Yeah. Do you want to take a step back and talk about sort of the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer and just the campaign aspects of it?
In what way?
So you've got some really nice notes here about world building, also the problems of Greyhawk and how it's kind of written up.
Yeah, sure. I'll get to that. So as we step into talking about Greyhawk as a setting, we just want to put this out there. At least I do, and I hope Teos agrees with me.
Yeah,
that we are going to be talking about concepts of race, of politics, of economies, as it pertains to world building. And you can't talk about race without acknowledging racism. You can't talk about politics without acknowledging that there is a power imbalance in worlds. You can't talk about things that happen in a real world, whether that world is real or fantasy, without acknowledging there are problematic things that happen in a world, both real and fantasy. So while we don't want to turn this into a sociology class, what we do need to recognize is that both real worlds and fantasy worlds are imperfect.
Yeah.
And we need to acknowledge those issues if we are doing our jobs even a quarter of the way correctly.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I want to give an example, which is that we talked about last time how Gary Gygax was influenced by these world maps that were in our encyclopedias that showed, the migration paths of peoples. And that happens here and is preserved in this 3rd edition book with these same paths being shown. And a big concept of the world is sort of these technologically advanced, magically advanced people moving across into areas that are peopled, and those people have to move. And sometimes there's intermingling, and sometimes there's just destruction or enslavement or you name it. And it's just treated as is, which was very much how things were in Gary and Dave's day of just like that's the way our world history is, right? And there's both. So there's a lot of negative to that, which has to do with just offhandedly, yeah, okay, the Flen people were primitive and natives, and so they just get shunted aside, right? It's got that kind of angle to it. It also, when people ask often, what's the difference between Greyhawk and the Forgotten Realms, or why do you create a different experience, ostensibly, possibly a better experience? When you think of the Forgotten Realms, it's often hard to jive that with, say, TV shows, historical reenactments of Rome or the Norse or anything like that, right? Because it doesn't have that sort of grit to it. It doesn't have that feeling of sort of these peoples clashing in quite the same way. There are a few areas of the realms where that is true, but it doesn't really resonate and come from the books. In Greyhawk, it really does. Greyhawk puts all of these countries against each other with very little stability, if any, to the setting. And so it feels like at any point, the northern barbarian tribes can come down and attack. And in fact, they've done several times throughout the history, and there's all kinds of myth and prophecy that will lead them to do it again. And all of this. And the Sul are doing this, and the Oridians and the Beclunish. And that is both problematic and also can be kind of cool if you like those kinds of dramas and stories and want a little more of that real world type imbalance and so on.
Right. And what you said there at the end is the important key. It's, well, the real world is racist. The real world is imperialist.
Right.
And so why shouldn't my fantasy world be? I want to play those things out. I want to explore those things. And it's fine to do that if it's something that you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
But way, way too often, the things that we think, oh, it's no problem exploring racism in this game, in this world, because some of us don't face that in the real world.
Right.
Whereas the people who do face that in the real world may not want to explore that, may not want to. They're living it. They don't want to play it as well.
Right.
And that's the sort of thing that we always need to be cognizant of as we build our world, as we build our settings. And so, like I said, I want to look at Greyhawk as it is presented, but we will always be cognizant of the things that are being described there are things that people in our real world face or have faced or will continue to face. And for those folks, it's not a game. And we understand that. We recognize that.
Yeah. I also thought, and you've got something about this also in our show notes, but it struck me when I was reading through this, there are some really great pieces in this, right? And I should say, it's not like you have to go into that real world side of things. There is a lot here to do that is more like the Forgotten Realms, and you can certainly focus in on any one part of the world and have a lot of fun without these kinds of issues. But the thought I had when looking through this was that actually building a campaign setting is an art that feels like it hasn't advanced significantly across the years the way that adventure design has, right? Like there's no equivalent of like, when the Hickmans created Ravenloft or Rahasia or Pharaoh, we all said, wait, we can do that. There hasn't been that, I feel like, on the setting side where we really go, oh, this is how you make it. And there are a lot of things about these kinds of books, it's true of Forgotten Realms too, that it's like there's so much here. What am I supposed to do with this enormous world? And Gary wanted it to even be bigger, as we talked about last episode, but there's so much here. And so you've got to pick a portion of the world where you're going to be in, probably. Yeah. But so much has been done, right? It's interesting.
And I'm struggling with this right now because in the spring of 2025, I will probably be teaching a class on world building for stories and games.
Yeah.
And the first thing you do is like, are there any good books on this? And I go and I look, and no, there isn't. There are some things
Right.
on it.
Kobold guides and
I
things like that. But
yeah, I went to the Kobold guide, and I think I contributed to one. It wasn't on world building, but it might have been on like monster and encounter design or something. But I go to the world building book and I look, and it's all interesting information, but it all sort of takes what's come before and says this is how other worlds have been created, the pantheons have been created,
mm-hmm.
or this is how the commerce for a world has been created. But it doesn't look at it forward thinking. It sort of looks at it as what's already been.
Yeah.
And this class I'm going to be teaching is they are going to be writing. They are going to be building, not studying the worlds. They're going to be building the worlds.
Wow.
So I'm trying to come up with a reading list, if you will, or something that I can draw from. And it's hard. It's very hard. So one of the reasons I'm glad we're doing this is because I get to at least think about it before I do it.
Yeah, and I mean the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, right? It's the last step that really exists, right? There's no 4th edition Greyhawk. So this is the end of the line historically where we are currently in terms of Greyhawk existing until whatever we get with 2024, and which we would guess is not going to be an entire book on Greyhawk. So this is kind of the greatest thing we have is this Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, the last huge official publication of what Greyhawk is like. It still advances the timeline, right? So it ends up further than previous projects. It's 100 something years after the original box set. And this, or no, 70, I think 70 years after the original box set. And so it really becomes the what we have for Greyhawk today is this book trying to define all that has come, all that is, and creating that potential for what will be. In general, one of the things that Greyhawk does do really well as a setting is being open enough that you can choose what to do with it. I would say that the box set, the original box set or the folio, are more open than this. The Living Greyhawk Gazetteer does fall into the trap that I see the Forgotten Realms do, where there's all this history, and I don't know that we care.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when there's so many different kingdoms to read about. I don't know that you need all this history and lore and ancient kings and queens and whatever's. It's just, but people are different about lore, right? To me, I always want things to be actionable. And that is one of the challenges with campaign settings, is to give you these bits that you want to act upon. I think still Greyhawk, even in this book, it's better than others at giving you that ability to say, oh, wow, there's a lot going on. This feels like a powder keg. This feels like there are a lot of opportunities. I want to base my campaign here and do these things. And there are reasons I will interact with the regions near me.
Yep. Yeah, totally. As a professional liar, because that's what, storytellers, fiction writers are, we're professional liars. There's this old saying of, right, you want your lies to be simple. Because the more detailed your lie gets, the harder it is to entwine that lie with everything else, with your other lies as well as with reality. But you do want to give a couple very precise and graphic details to your lie to make it sound authentic, right? So you don't say, I was at the show last night, when you weren't. I was at the show last night. Oh, there was this guy. He was wearing this purple outfit and these gold chains, and one of the, on the chain, one of them said "Mom." You tell that lie, you're good. You're golden. You've told it detail.
Very
People
convincing.
can visualize it. They can visualize the purple suit. They can visualize the gold chain. Throw in those senses, and people are drawn in. They were more willing to believe you. But if you keep it going too much, then you're going to lose sight of what you've already said. And for me, world building is exactly the same way.
I love that.
Right? You want to give details, but the more strict you make those details, the more granular you try to be in this lie, this world that you're making, the harder it is to reconcile everything else that you do later on down the line.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so in this story, those granular details are the adventures that you could play. Adventures move forward. History looks backward. So it's
Hmm.
fine to
Yeah.
use the history to build the forward-looking stuff, but if you're always looking back, when you actually try to create adventures in the world, you're looking in the wrong direction because you
Yeah.
need to be looking forward.
I think that Greyhawk has a setting more than most, partly through the product of its time and its creators that we talked about last time. It really leans into things like military might, right? So it's the
Mhm,
kind of setting where it cares that this nation has archers, right? It
mhm, mhm,
cares that they have knights on horseback who are, or an adventuring company of great prominence. It cares about the resources that are being extracted from the land and sold and traded and so on. Um, it cares about the strength of its rulers, right? It has that kind of very old school feel around how it's writing up all these regions.
mhm,
And that can help tell certain stories. It can certainly help you tell gritty, real world type stories. But it also can be hard to parse because it's
mhm,
getting into things like the economies and the politics of it that can leave you after reading it feeling like if you mess with it, you're going to do it wrong.
mhm.
It feels not yours, you know? I think the book to me is at its best, maybe because I'm not fascinated so much by those types of things. It feels at its best when it creates these interesting conflicts and clashes, of which it has many. It also has some super, super brilliant, amazing ideas of things that are happening or were done recently that leave you with these questions. They're mysterious, they're not fully explained. And all of that kind of makes you want to go, what can I do with this, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. As you're building your world, no under with the understanding that people will be playing a game in it. It's going to be different if you're only telling stories in it. With people playing a game in it, the thing you have to ask with every detail you add to your world is, are the players going to grasp that, or are they going to say, so what? What does that mean to me?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the more you can make it so that they would care, a normal person would care about that, then you are doing your justice to not just your setting, but to the players who will be playing in it. So you can talk about the great kingdom, the kingdom of Arity, all you want, and all the history of it, and all the things that happened. So what? What does that mean to me, who is going to be going to this ruin to search for this lost magic item? If that lost magic item harkens back to something that happened to a ruler, maybe I'm interested
Mm-hmm.
a little bit, but not enough that it's going to keep me from my main question, which is how the heck do I get into that ruin and how do I defeat the dragon that's guarding the magic item?
Yep. Yep.
So,
Yeah.
yes, all of that. So, as Teo said, we're now going to do a deeper dive into the Living Greyhawk Gazetteer, which I'm holding up again, since it was the last official publication. It's where a lot of people got their start, not just in Greyhawk, but in D&D. And we are going to go through it. We'll give a really brief overview before we dig in, probably next time.
Mm-hmm.
But a
Yeah,
couple
looking
of
at
the
the time,
chapters,
there's so much
yeah,
so much fun to talk about all these angles to
I,
to this book and the Living Greyhawk campaign.
yeah,
And it's one nice thing that's remarkable about this book is that it was done with the plans in place, very non-wizards like. It was done with the plan in place of having an organized play campaign, right? Sometimes you write something and you go, oh, hey, we should do an organized play campaign. But this was supporting that to some extent, right? I mean, if we go into
mhm,
the history of folks who were doing the regions, there was a lot that was still unclear, right? So, like, I remember the Jeff region was
mhm,
handed out, and the people on the team, the triad members who were going to administer this, said, wait a minute, this is a land where, if we're looking at this history correctly, our entire land has been taken over by giants.
mhm,
We have no actual city. The city we kind of have is really being held by the Grand March, our neighbor, who is super military, and they want to end up owning it and maybe even all of our land. What the heck are we going to do with that? And what the
mhm,
answer ended up being is actually it was brilliant because it was a very clear campaign about
mhm.
defeating the giants and
Yep.
dealing with your neighbors And it became one of the best campaigns out there story wise, because it had that real clear, like, what do we do now, right? And call for heroic action that really inspired players. Let's retake our country from the giants and figure out why they attacked in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, that in itself, plus the Fae connection that Jeff had, those two storylines where they could separate and intertwine lasted the whole campaign. It lasted several years, and it was great because it was so active. It was so the players know what their goals are.
Yeah.
The region that I became a triad member for a little over a year after the campaign started was Keoland, which had this grand history. It was a large and sprawling empire with several different factions and lots of intrigue and political intrigue. And that was less about looking forward and more about looking back. So when I came on, one of my mandates, I don't know if it was given to me or it was a self-inflicted mandate, was let's focus the action outward. Let's keep make the characters interested, not in what happened 1,000 years ago, but what's happening right now. Let's make a few of these threads. And so it was hard to do. It was hard to do, but I'm glad I got that region because it taught me immediately all of these lessons that I've learned over the years more slowly, which is put the action in front of the characters, not behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting to see all those regions struggle. And I think there was a lot of learning as for those who could get in a car and travel or in a plane to another region, and you saw the regions doing it well, and in some cases learning from the ones that didn't do it well, then you could really see like, oh, wow, this is how great world building can happen and great storytelling and great community building and all of that, right? Fun epics, fun interactive adventures, those kinds of things. And that was fantastic learning that came from that. I mean, it's where a lot of us of our age cut our teeth, was on these experiences and those lessons.
So why don't we just do like the first chapter, which is very, very short. Sound good? Well, the chapters themselves of the book are as follows. Chapter 1 is Greyhawk's World. Chapter 2 is The Folk of the Fleneus. Chapter 3 is The Path of History. Chapter 4, The Gazetteer of the Fleneus. Chapter 5, Geography of the Fleneus. 6, The Power Groups. 7, Greyhawk Gods. And then the appendix is The Living Greyhawk Campaign. So chapter 1 is only a couple of pages. And it sort of gives an overview of the large scale things that you might want to know about a world when you're playing it. We get the typical vague introduction, which I love to hate on these because it's Greyhawk is, I'm not quoting it, but I'm being facetious now. Greyhawk is a world of darkness and intrigue with mysteries and magic and right. It describes.
I can quote you. Good folks struggle against evil and law wrestles with chaos. Earth is a world of magic, mystery, and the imagination. So yep.
Yeah. As opposed to all the other worlds where, everybody just sits around and it's completely fine. Right. So, I obviously it needs to be done, but one of my missions, you know what? That's going to be one of the assignments in my class. Thank you, Teos, for doing that. One of my assignments is to write an actual good telling introduction that actually draws out what's good and different about the world.
Well, and I love, one of the things that 4th edition did very smartly, and you can find it in the Dark Sun book, you can find it in the Neverwinter Guide, is this idea of what are the truths of the world, right? And they like itemized, 5 to 10 bullet points of this is what's different, right? And it's something that starts in the 4th edition Dungeon Masters Guide, where it says, hey, here are the concepts all worlds have, like all D&D worlds have. So what happens if you turn them upside down? So define your setting by saying, here are the things that are contrary, right? And I think our audience would say that might be a good thing for us to cover at some point, is to say, well, how would we bulletize? I'm not going to do it maybe impromptu, but maybe something to think about of like, when people say, how is Greyhawk different? Well, what would those bullet points be, right?
Oh, that's a great point. We learn from this very short chapter that Greyhawk City is, quote, the gem of this world. And that is very true in a lot of different senses, right? As the financial hub of the world for the most part. That's where most of the wealth comes through. But it's also the gem because that was where it started, right? That's where Gary started this world. Greyhawk City springing up around Castle Greyhawk.
Yeah.
So it's the center of the world in many different ways.
Though I always object to the use gem, because a gem is how I might explain Waterdeep, right? Which both has storied history through the Undermountain, but also it is a wondrous, beautiful city. Whereas Greyhawk, while it has some beautiful areas, I mean, it is a little closer to, scum and villainy than it is gem status.
Oh, both. I would say both, right?
Okay.
It does have its sections like any city would. But yeah. Then we get the mention of the Greyhawk campaign focusing on the Flanaess, which is the easternmost portion of one of its continents. The continent is Orc, and the world is Orth, Oerth. I'm just going to pronounce it Earth from now on. But so it's a section of
it's
a
pronounced
continent.
Sigil.
Yes, it's pronounced Sigil. Sigil. So there is a larger world out there, but we really only know about this one part of this one continent. The book clarifies that this is more than just a setting. It is a launch point for the Living Greyhawk campaign. So a lot of times we get a setting book and it just talks about saying, this really leans into this concept of we're starting here, but this campaign is going to take us forward in a lot of different ways, and that's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
We get a section on heavens. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, it tells us the celestial bodies. It tells us that kind of the idea that this setting does not have a lot of knowledge around the rest of the world that is beyond what's detailed here, and that the information in these pages generally represents things that scholars and common folk would know, but that indication of bigger secrets existing out there. We get that there are two moons, one greater and one minor. And we get days of the week: Star Day, Sunday, Moon Day, God's Day, Water Day, Earth Day, Free Day, with one day being for worship and one day for rest. And then we have a table of the different months and what they call them and how it maps to seasons, and kind of how different peoples, elven or nomads, see them and call them different things.
Yep. I love how for the climate and the seasons, it's basically describing the U.S. Midwest, but a slightly more temperate, maybe the southern Midwest, because there are 4 seasons, but those seasons are equidistant, except summers are a little longer.
Yeah.
So you have
summers.
a good amount of crop growing time. Now, obviously, there are extremes. There's the far north. There are jungles in the south, et cetera, et cetera. And then we get the geographic divisions that they will adhere to throughout the setting. So there's the Bacloonish West, the Bitter North, the Western Near Dive, the Near Dive is a huge body of water, lake, the Sheldamar Valley, the Empire of Ayuz, the Thrillonrian Peninsula, Old Aerde West, Old Aerde East, and then Isolated Realms. And next time we will talk about each of those areas, sort of how they were made and what they represent in terms of Greyhawk, and then in terms of world building in general.
Yeah.
Sound like a plan?
Sounds like an excellent plan.
Awesome. Thank you, Teos. And thank you to all our listeners. We hope that this has been enlightening and informing. Thank you to our patrons, whether you're a Master of Dungeon supporter, whether you're a Master of Realm supporter who gets a shout out in our show notes, or whether you are a Master of the Multiverse patron who gets mentioned right now. Patrons such as Walt Winfrey, Chris Webster, Javier Waziak, Graham Ward, James Walton, Marcelo Velasquez, The Valiant DM, Joe Tyler, Therese, Jeremy Talloman from the D&D and TV podcast, Josh and Lowanica of the Tabletop Journeys podcast, Krishna Simonse, Andy Shockney, Ross Sandberg, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Vladimir Prenner from Croatia, Robert Pasley, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Mighty Zeus, Mike Olson, Tom Nelson, creator of the Deck of Player Safety, Falcon Neal, Sean Molly, John Mickey, Trey McLemore, Eric Bengi, The Mathemagician, Paul Mata, Chad Lench, Jim Klingler, a.k.a. DM Prime Mover, Brian King, Sean Hurst, Ben Heisler, and Paige Lightman, the mighty Did I say James Fisher? James Fisher. If I missed you, there you are again. Andy Edmonds at Nerdronomicon.com. Will Doyle, Evil John. Welcome to Western New York, Evil John. Calvin Bridges, Avalos. Merrick Blackman, Steve Bissonette, Dave Bastianson, Craig Bailey, Lou Anders of Lazy Wolf Studios, and Keith Ammon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing. And a special welcome to Question Asker this week. That's right, Jason Ward. Thank you. And if you would like to become a patron of the show and get your name read and mangled horribly by one me, you can go to patreon.com/masteringdnd and become a patron. Teos, congratulations on your nomination for
Thank you.
Best Online Content, any nomination.
Yeah, voting is open. Vote away. Everybody can vote away.
I've already voted. Not for you, but I voted.
Yeah, no, sure.
So where can people find your Emmy-nominated work?
Find me at alphastream.org. And from there, you will find all the other things I am involved in. Where are you hiding,
Awesome.
Sean?
I am hiding on social media at Sean Merwin on all those places. And you can follow the podcast on most of those places at Mastering D&D. Also, go to YouTube if you want to know what we look like.
It's true.
Be forewarned, it's not pretty, but you can go to YouTube.
Or
and you can find
are you
us
watching talented voice actors
pretending?
This might not be us.
That could be it. It might not be. It might not be.
It's us.
Yeah, no one would. No one would do that.
You wouldn't substitute in this stuff. So
no,
okay.
that would be out. But anyway, you could go to YouTube, youtube.com/@masteringdungeons, and you can subscribe and like and comment and do all of that goodness. So next week we will take a deeper look at the world of Greyhawk. But before that, what are we going to do now?
Well, I think that it's time for us to look at our neighbors and decide whether we should take over their territories.
I see a twin cataclysm coming, Teos. I see a twin cataclysm in our future.
I didn't have twins, so I wouldn't know.
Okay.